Thank you so much, Ollie. So today I'll be today will be the meet the expert lecture in conversation, focusing on the arms and armor from early 19th century Iran. So that's our kind of meet the expert month. And this month I will be in conversation with Fuchsia Hart about one of the star pieces in our collection, and certainly one of the most iconic pieces of 19th century arms and armor in the collection, which is this this rich inlaid body armor inscribed with the name of Fath Ali Shah Qajar, one of Iran's most iconic kings. Fuchsia is an art historian specializing in the material culture of the reign of Fath Ali Shah. She has worked in the past on the Iran collection at the V&A, and she's currently finishing her doctoral thesis on the major shrines in Iran and Iraq during Fath Ali Shah's reign. And additionally, an article on English ceramics at Fath Ali Shah's court that you've written will be published, I think, next year. So that's coming up. Fuchsia, I'm so happy that you're able to join us today and share with us your expertise about the material culture of Fath Ali Shah's reign. I think arms and armor, certainly me coming from an arms and armor background, it's something that's often seen as quite separate from kind of art history more widely, and subjects like manuscript painting or ceramics or architecture, which I think is a great shame. And I always kind of think of arms and armor as a kind of almost like an architecture of the self, something that is it's something that's worn in public, it's meant to be seen by others, and it's something that's worn in really very ritualized settings. You've got your ceremonies, parades, for instance, but also the battlefield, which is of course a very ritualized scene in which visual markers of hierarchy, for example, play a big role. So what I'd really like to talk to you about today is what can we find out about this armor from contextualizing it in the broader material culture of Fath Ali Shah's reign, and also maybe what can arms and armor tell us about this kind of broader context as well. So kind of both ways. This particular armor is of course particularly interesting because it's been inscribed with the name of Fath Ali Shah Qajar, and those who can read Persian can see it right in the center of our kind of opening slide. Can you tell us a little bit about who he was?
Of course, but I will crack on really soon because I know we've got so much that we want to fit in. But I also want to say thank you for having me here, and that I'm really excited. I knew nothing about arms and armor. As you said, coming from the field of Islamic art, where we don't really talk about it as a medium that much. And I've learned so much from you about it, and I'm really excited to be bringing this into conversation with the broader material culture of Fath Ali Shah's reign. But okay, so we've introduced ourselves. Now we do need to introduce Fath Ali Shah briefly. Here he is, thank you. So Fath Ali was Shah, or king, of Iran from 1797 until 1834 as the second ruler from the dynasty known as the Qajars. Before him, his uncle, Agha Muhammad Khan, and later Shah, had united much of the land which we now know as Iran. This was all in the wake of the fall of the dynasty, which is often seen as sort of a golden age, the Safavid dynasty, who fell in the early 18th century. So Agha Muhammad Khan was really a military leader who was responsible for reuniting those lands. But then after his death, when Fath Ali Shah came to the throne in 1797, it really fell to Fath Ali Shah to build much of the statecraft and the political mechanisms which would see the Qajar dynasty through Iran's 19th century, really. And he did that in many ways. And one of the ways which I really want to mention now, because it's something which will echo through our discussion, I think, is that he did draw on those perceived glories of dynasties past, whether they're pre-Islamic dynasties or particularly the Safavids. he really used and drew on these precedents to help shape himself as a kind of legitimate Perso-Islamic ruler. But he has a kind of like checkered past. I mean, I'm a great fan of his, but not everybody is. He did lose considerable amounts of land to Russia, namely Azerbaijan. And because of this, he is in some ways remembered in Iran today as a Shah who was not particularly successful. He is seen as having, you know, frittered away the coffers, the state coffers, on unsuccessful military campaigns and other things. But I'd say his reputation has been rehabilitated slightly in the past decade or two through some really solid scholarship on him, which is showing that actually he employed a raft of political strategies which were actually relatively successful in holding Iran together throughout the first 3 decades in the 19th century, particularly if we bear in mind that he was facing the imperial powers of England, France, and Russia at the time, and he kept them largely at bay. Of course, and this is obviously particularly apt for today, he also employed the arts and architecture as a really important facet of his state building and also of the building of his own image. But that's something that I'm going to develop a little bit later. What we need to know from you now is more specifically about this wonderful piece that we're going to look at.
Yes, absolutely. Let's have a look at this armor, because it is, like you say, it is a really wonderful work of art. And I'm going to do something slightly unusual when it comes to looking at arms and armor. I'm going to look at the inside first. As you can see here, it has a lining, a very attractive lining, which we believe is the original lining. It is late 18th century, but the line, late 18th century, but it's English, or likely English. It's at the very least European. And it's a really high quality velvet, very kind of very carefully made, and then it's lined with like attached to the armor with gold thread. So it's really a very rich inner side of the armor, and that's completely in line with the outside of the armor, which is of course, well, as you can see, covered in gold, very richly decorated. It's made of watered steel, which is called that because it has a very nice fine pattern that is kind of reminiscent of watered silk. So it's not, it doesn't directly refer to water. It looks like watered silk. And the way this pattern is made is kind of lost to time. We don't really know exactly how it was made. But we do know that it has to do with the kind of the carbon content in the steel. So it's a very high carbon steel, very high quality steel, and as a result, very expensive, essentially. And because it's so expensive, of course, you want to show that off. And so you see in lots of armor design, not just in our armor, but in armor design in general, you see that kind of the central plates, the central kind of part of the composition is often left relatively open. You can see here, the borders are very clearly kind of filled with gold, but then in the middle, you can really see the steel. And that is in part to kind of show off the quality of the steel. Know that you have good steel. Of course, this is, yeah, so that's something that's important. You might not be able to see, we have some close-ups later and you'll be able to see it a little bit better. You might not be able to see the pattern here. And one of the reasons for that is that in the late 19th century, the early 20th century, in Europe, there was a real fashion, a real taste for armor looking kind of as shiny as possible. You really want to show up the kind of like the brightness of it. And so what conservators at the time did was really polish it. And of course, polishing it really thoroughly gets rid of the pattern. It becomes really difficult to see the pattern. So it's not as visible today as it would have been in the time of Fath Ali Shah. So that's something to bear in mind as well, I think. Of course, being such high quality steel, it is actually quite suitable for the battlefield. You might look at it and think, this is so richly decorated, surely this is just for a parade or for a performance or for at court, something like that. But actually, it's a fully functional piece of armor, really. It's made of the highest quality steel. It's the way it's kind of put together. It's really high quality. And I think the only caveat with that is that by the early 19th century, the battlefield is guns, it's cannons, and the actual practical applicability of an armor like this, of course, is less for that reason. So if I just want to talk really quickly about the kind of the way it's constructed. I already mentioned the kind of the gold border. And then also I want to point out here that it's put together with hinges, and it's a little difficult to see here. If we go back to the previous image, you can see it a lot easier, of course, from the inside. And that's quite unusual. It's an innovation that comes to Iran in kind of the late 18th century, probably from India, where it's been around for a little longer, and maybe kind of indirectly from Europe. And here in the center of the front, this is the front, by the way, and on the right, you can see the back of the armor. The kind of the central pattern, that is also a hinge. It's not, it doesn't open. It's not like a kind of like a door almost, or like a shirt, I guess. But it does give a kind of an added bit of flexibility by having that hinge. And if we compare it to kind of older armor, this is 18th century, so not that much older, and from India, although armors are very, very, very comparable between India and Iran at this time period. We see that the traditional armor form in Iran it's 4 pieces. We can see 3 here. We can see front and two sides. There will also be a back plate. And this is kind of, this is the classical way of thing. And your arm would go kind of over here, if that makes sense. And it's put together with straps. And you think, of course, this leaves lots of space. The idea is that you would wear this over mail. So that would give you a kind of like added protective quality. This is called Chahra, which means 4 mirrors. So that's kind of, it's the quintessential kind of armor form. But then when we go back to our armor, we can see that this is much more fitted to the human body. And yeah, like I said, this is something that's kind of introduced in the late 18th century. In Iran, it's been around in India for a bit longer. So possibly where it came from, but that's kind of, it's new. When this is made, it's kind of, it's a relatively new idea still. And you get to see design elements that you don't see on the 4-plate armor, which is kind of these formed pectoral muscles, for example. And so one thing that Fuchsia, I think you would like to talk about is that, so where does that come from? This is not a design element that you see on traditional armor in Iran. So I'm going to go to the next slide. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is something that we, I think, really struck us, was that actually, if you could just go back to the last slide for me, because what I do just want to point out is obviously Arthur has just really pointed out something that's quite distinctive about this are these really quite so like prominently shaped pectoral muscles with these inscriptions on them. And then this made us think of, next slide please, the talismanic shirt. And of course, this is, so we chose this as an example of a real sort of high example of the type. It's a well-known example from the Met in New York. And yes, it's from India and it's much earlier than the piece we're looking at. But it's a really nice example of the form of these, which they do often bear very distinctive what we would call talismanic inscriptions, often over the chest or the breast. And so that's something that immediately struck us as being interesting about the way the inscriptions are placed on our piece of armor. And there's a second example of a talismanic shirt, which I really wanted to bring into dialogue here with the pieces that we've already looked at, which is an example from the V&A, which is absolutely, it's one of my favorite objects. So I had to just get it in here somewhere. Again, it's a talismanic shirt in very similar form to the one that you just saw from the Met. But instead of having inscriptions on those 2 points on the chest, it actually has these 2 depictions of 2 shrines. The shrine on the left is actually the burial site of the Prophet Muhammad. And the shrine on the right is the tomb of Imam Ali, who is one of the great figures of the Islamic tradition, and particularly venerated in the Shi'i tradition, which I'm going to begin to talk about a bit more now as we look more into the inscriptions which we see on the armour. But this is interesting for me because kind of drawing on what Arthur said at the beginning, I really like this little hint about thinking of armour as this kind of architecture of the self and the body, and the protection that brings, but also the sort of external references that brings. And in many ways, the architecture does act in a similar way. And I think the connections between the shrines and the armour are going to hopefully multiply as we go. But again, so this is just to show that often the most sort of, in a way, the bit of the shirt or garment that you're wearing that's most protective is that bit that's the most loaded with protection of some sort or other is over the shirt. Sorry, the chest of the shirt. Okay, so now moving back to the armour, to focus in on those inscriptions a bit more now that we've just had that comparison with the talismanic shirts. These two inscriptions I'll start with on the chest. They're both sort of Quranic phrases, which mean respectively, the one on the left means that there is no victory except from God, and the one on the right tells us that there is no victory except, no success except through God. And then other than that, as you can see now, we've got this close-up image on the right. It is, even though we've got this kind of scroll work running all across the surface of the armour, it's really thick with inscriptions as well. And I kind of have identified, I've sort of broken the inscriptions down into 3 different sections, 3 different types. Although I do want to add that we are indebted to the work of a couple of people before us, A.V.B. Norman and also Rachel Parikh have already looked at the inscriptions on this. But we've tried to hopefully add a little bit of something to it. So the first category of inscription, if Arthur's got the control of the PowerPoint, so
yes.
I need you to point some things out for me. So as you can see, we've got this inscription running along the edge of the panel at the front. We've got larger cartouches and smaller cartouches. And in those smaller cartouches, we've got a number of the names and epithets of God. Now, some of you have probably heard about the 99 names of God, his attributes, and some of these are drawn from that, him being referenced as the protector or the conqueror. But we actually have some extra epithets here as well, which are actually quite common to the Shi'i tradition. Now, I think this is the moment where I do just have to stop. I know we're dealing with one of those sort of mixed audiences today of people who know a lot about this and people who will know nothing about this. So for those of you who know something about it, you're just going to have to bear with me for a minute. Because the Qajars were a Shi'i dynasty, and by Shi'ism, what we're referring to here is the strand of Islam, which really grew out of support for Ali. That is the son-in-law of the Prophet. He was married to the Prophet's daughter Fatima. Support of him as the leader of the nascent Islamic community, and support thereafter for his descendants as leaders of the Islamic community. And I'll be referencing a number of these people as we go throughout. So there are a number of very significant prayers within the Shi'i tradition. And one of them, which is often recited on Thursday nights, it's recited during also certain celebrations and monumental times in the Shi'i calendar, is a prayer called the Joshan al-Kabir. And the reason why I want to sort of give you that name is because, interestingly, for our purposes, this translates, that's its Arabic name, this translates into English as the Great Armour. So this is a prayer which has protective properties, and it's invoking God through 1,001 names to provide protection. And this for me, once I sort of started looking at the inscriptions and realizing that that was what it was connected to, I find really interesting, obviously, as Arthur said, this this armor could provide physical protection if it really had to. I mean, maybe not from a bullet, but it's going to provide you with some physical protection. But on top of the steel, in addition to this hardened steel, we've got a different type of protection, which is the protection which is brought by the invocations of these myriad names of God, which has been inscribed on it. So that for me is very significant as marking out this piece as distinctively Shi'i. And there are other things as well that mark it out as distinctively religious. And so that was my first type of inscription, of these epithets, these invocations calling on God. The second type we've got is poetry. That's actually in the larger cartouches here. We've got poetry in Arabic again, which invokes the names of the Prophet and Ali and Fatima, and then their descendants, Hassan, Hussein, etc., who were the leaders of the Islamic community, as were the claimed leaders of the Islamic community according to the Alids or the Shia, who would be known as the 12 Imams. So this invokes all the names of the 12 Imams. And then the third type of inscription, which I've already commented on because I've just commented on these inscriptions on the chest. The third type is Quranic. So we also have Quranic inscriptions, and they largely come from one chapter specifically of the Quran, which is the Surat al-Fath, which is the 48th chapter of the Quran. Which does have its own historical context of Muhammad's military campaigns. Actually, I should say that Fath means victory or conquest. But in this context, it's very commonly a chapter from the Quran, which is inscribed on arms and armor. So in some ways that's something that we're not surprised to see here. But I think this combination of inscriptions leads us to sort of ask, is this something that was worn on the battlefields? Is this something, are these inscriptions there to protect the wearer, who I would really love to be Fath Ali Shah, but are they protecting the wearer during battle? Or are they there because this is being worn as part of a religious ritual of some sort? Or are they just purely talismanic to be worn, at any other time, not necessarily a battle? All we can say for sure is that they are distinctly religious and distinctly Shi'i in nature. But I know that now, thinking back again to the materiality of the armour, which is not my speciality, it's Arthur's speciality, thinking back to the materiality of it, there's also another type of inscription that has some interesting things for you to tell us about.
Yes, I want to talk about the last kind of inscription, which I'm going to highlight here. And those are a handful of small cartouches. There's at least one on every single plate of the armour, so all 5 components have at least a small cartouche. And I've kind of, you can see it here in the center, and then I've highlighted it here, and you can see it up close. And the reason I want to show it up close is because what puts these cartouches apart from the rest of the armor, or rest of the overlay at least, is that they are applied in a different technique or a subtly different technique, I should say. It's not a huge difference. A subtly different technique to the rest of the gold decoration. And that the technique that's used here, or at least the technique that's used for the inscriptions that you've just discussed, Fuchsia, are applied in a technique called gold overlay. In the past, it's also been called false damascening. Some people refer to it by a Persian word called kuftgari. It all refers to kind of the same technique, which holds that you cross-hatch the surface of the steel, very, very kind of small cuts to kind of make it a really rough surface. And then you hammer the gold onto the steel. And of course, having just cross-hatched it, the gold will stick a lot better to the steel. And that's kind of how the design stays where it should be. So that's the technique, and that's used for the entirety of the armor. But there's a small difference. almost all of the design has been drawn using the cross-hatching. So only what was going to be gold has been cross-hatched, and the gold's just been applied to it. And you can see that here. You can see where the gold is gone. You can see that it's been cross-hatched, and you can see that it's not been cross-hatched in any other part of the inscription, or sorry, the decoration here, because this is not description. However, the small cartouches use this technique slightly differently. So they've cross-hatched the entire field of the cartouche, and then drawn the design using the gold. So it's a subtle difference, and one skill doesn't necessarily translate to the other skill. Traditionally, the method used for the cartouches has been thought of as slightly easier, slightly cheaper, but also not getting the same results because your background, of course, remains crosshatched. And it's not really possible to kind of, well, in theory, it's possible to polish that off, but it's clear that's not been done here because the other cartouches, similar size, they show none of that kind of cross-hatching, as you can see here in the smaller, the Quranic, I think, inscription here. So that's quite interesting. And then, of course, what makes this relevant is the content of those cartouches, like what's actually written in the cartouches. And we find that here the name of Fath Ali Shah is given, his titles are given, Sultan ibn al-Sultan, and also a date is recorded, not in the one that I've highlighted here, but in you can see it actually here at the bottom. You'll see Sultan ibn al-Sultan, and then the date, which is 1224 in the Muslim calendar, which corresponds to 1809 or 1810 in the Christian calendar. So what does that, that raises a lot of questions, of course, this being in a different technique and these titles being used. And I would like, Fuchsia, what do you make of this? How would you place this in the larger context?
There we go. I know. I was like, I've muted myself. Yeah, this is great. I mean, I'd say this is one of the major puzzles that we've been trying to, think through and work out, that his names have been put on a different technique. But what I think now we really want to do, because the way that we can try to work through this a little bit is by thinking about broader production in this period. So I'm going to take us back, if I can have the next slide, please.
Yes.
Thank you. I want to take us back to this portrait, which we started with when I was introducing Fath Ali Shah himself, because the reason I chose this particular portrait of him is because it was actually painted in the same year as our Armour is dated. So that's 1224 or 1809-10 in our calendar. I will just briefly introduce the arts and architecture of the period to sort of give us that broader context in which we can situate this armour, because as I mentioned, the arts and architecture were very significant during Fath Ali Shah's reign. He's accused of a lot of things, but you cannot accuse him of being lax when it comes to being a patron of the arts and architecture. He was a great supporter of the arts. He has been accused of, that's been kind of like part of the hallmark of this impression of him as sort of a profligate, decadent despot, in many ways, but that was pretty ineffective. Thankfully, that's an impression of him that we've now moved on from in scholarship, and it's pretty clear that he was employing the arts and architecture in a very measured and planned way. And we know that, for example, when it comes to the paintings of him, that he participated in the staging of these paintings. He was involved in the directing, let's say, of sort of how the scene should be set. And I also want to add that as we see him here, even though he may look sort of idealized in some ways, we also know that what he's wearing and the pieces that accompany him, often the objects that accompany him, are real objects. These are not just idealized scenes. So here we can see I've just highlighted a couple of aspects here of him in this painting. because on the left, I've just zoomed in on that detail of him, of course, with a dagger, and on the right of him with a sword. And these are objects that he, that very, very frequently in almost all of the paintings, these large, I should say this is sort of a full-scale, life-size representation of him. These are trappings that he is often wearing. There's one other reason why I chose this painting, and if we can have the next slide, please. There's one other aspect here which for me is interesting and relevant to the armour and to this discussion of perhaps the fact that that his name may have been added to the armour by a different person, possibly in a different time and place. But I would argue really that in this period, objects that bear Fath Ali Shah's name and his title really were the remit of the court. I mean, I don't want to go as far to say that, you know, they had a complete monopoly on it, but I would say that experience of the wider material culture of the period does show that objects which are marked with his name, and as you can see here, for those of you that read Persian, obviously you'll be able to see it, but for those of you who don't, it's this very similar shaped cartouche to the one that we saw on the armour, which bears Fath Ali Shah's name and his title of Sultan. This is naming him, and this is, I think, in many ways, it's similar to a seal. It's similar to sort of stamping this object as a product of his court as well. So that's something that we can maybe bear in mind when we're thinking of the role of the inscription of his name on the armour as well. But I also want to mention a few pieces of metalwork from this period as well. Thank you. Because this kind of will move me a bit more again towards the material culture of Shiism within this period, which I think is something that's important for what we're considering. And the two objects I've chosen here I've chosen them because they are metalwork, and they are made in that very similar technique of steel with gold overlay. They may be from a little bit later than Fath Ali Shah's reign, actually. They're more likely to be mid 19th century. They may be from the reign of Nasruddin Shah, but they're probably very similar to objects that were also used in Fath Ali Shah's reign. And both of these objects will have been used in religious ritual. So I mentioned earlier that Shiism, central to Shiism, is this support for the right of the descendants of the Prophet to lead the Islamic community. And many of the Shi'i rituals and events revolve around veneration of the family of the Prophet. And one such particular event is at the beginning of the Islamic month of Muharram, and it's an event called Ashura, which actually marks a battle called the Battle of Karbala, which took place in 680. And it's a long story, but I wish I'm not, unfortunately, we don't have time to go all into today, but during the battle, a number of members of the family of the Prophet, including the third Imam Hussein, were killed. And so commemoration started very soon after the battle, actually, and continued. And these objects were used as part of commemoration rituals of Karbala. And the main two types of commemoration during this period were either processions and parades, known as daste, and also ritual drama known as tazieh. And that's what I really just want to focus on for a minute, because tazieh has often been referred to as sort of passion plays, kind of drawing on the Christian tradition, but I prefer to call it ritual drama. It is ritual reenactment of the events of the Battle of Karbala, and the clue is in the fact that it's a battle, because the players and performers who would reenact these scenes would be wearing armour. And now it's often been sort of argued that it was really later in the 19th century that tazieh really took off and found its full form under the patronage of Nasruddin Shah, who was Fath Ali Shah's great-grandson and the fourth ruler of the Qajar dynasty. But more recent research, particularly by Lucy Deacon, a PhD student up in Edinburgh, and partially in my own research as well, I've come across examples of this, that tazieh was very much performed during Fath Ali Shah's reign. There's one very useful source, Arthur Connolly, a Brit, who passed through Mashhad in the east of Iran, where there's a significant shrine, which I'll come back to. He saw performances of Tazieh within the shrine in Mashhad in the 1820s. And he sort of explains that the performers were in proper dress, he says, which I would like to interpret, maybe optimistically, but I'd hope that that means that they may well have been wearing armour. They may not have been carrying arms. He tells us that he saw another performance in the viziers in the local governor's house in Mashhad, and that there the performers were also bearing swords. But so we really do, in Fath Ali Shah's reign, have arms and armour playing a role in religious ritual. That's the sort of point that I wanted to make with this helmet. And I wanted to include this bird because, of course, you may have noticed that we have small little birds on the top of the plates of our armour that we're discussing. And this bird is likely actually to have come from a military style standard, which would have been used during the processions, parades during Muharram to commemorate the Battle of Karbala. And that's something that actually wonderful work has been done on recently by Annabelle Collinet, has published on steel objects relating to those standards. So that just gives you a bit more of an idea of both the religious ritual performance and also the accompanying material culture, which happens during Fath Ali Shah's reign. But I think before I hand back over to Arthur, there's one more piece of evidence that I'd like to draw on, which, if I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. Which is that we actually do have another painting of Fath Ali Shah, which does depict him in armour. Now, you'll note that this is very different to the sort of armour that we're looking at. Here, he's wearing chain mail. And again, I'll note that these paintings, we know that they do depict him in what we could say as a realistic stance and wearing realistic objects. This painting may be slightly different. It's been argued that here, Fath Ali Shah is actually being represented sort of in the guise of one of Iran's great pre-Islamic heroes, the hero Rostam, who actually wore an animal skin, a leopard, I think it was a leopard skin, and that these are actually pearls with rubies in the centre that are embellishing this chainmail. That these spots are actually sort of mimicking the leopard spots that Rostam would have worn. But that's not to say that this chainmail is not a piece that actually could have existed. The vambraces certainly look pretty much as we'd expect them to look from this period. Of course, they're highly embellished. I feel like actually something that I should just add while I'm discussing this is that there's no other, at the moment, there's no other known armour associated with Fath Ali Shah. So we do have some of his weapons. There's a shield of his in Tehran, which is highly embellished, rubies and emeralds everywhere. But we don't have any of his armour, except potentially this piece at the Wallace Collection. So we can't really compare this mail with anything else. But it's possible that he really did wear something akin to this, I would say. But actually something I will note just the last thing before I hand over to you is that from this you can see that everything that Fath Ali Shah did and wore was always gem encrusted, and that actually, that was something for me that was sort of a bit of a surprise with this armour, that in some ways I would expect him to be wearing something more lavish.
Yes.
And I think that was something that maybe then led us to think maybe it would be something that might be worn in a religious context, because we do have records that tell us that when Fath Ali Shah visited the shrine, for example, he would wear black, and he would not be wearing any of his trappings except his pearl prayer beads. So maybe the fact that this armor is toned down slightly, let's say, could be an indication of it being used in a religious ritual setting, rather than the normal emeralds and rubies and all that. But I'm going to hand back over to you now, Arthur, I think.
Yes.
Take us
What I
through.
would, sorry. Yeah.
No, go on, go on.
What I really want to talk about is another armor. Of course, you know, you look at an armor like this and you start looking at other armors that look similar or have a similar kind of story to them. And one comparable armor that I think must be mentioned in this context is an armor in the Royal Collection here in the UK, which it's kind of from the same date. It's early 19th century. And you can see it is very similar in kind of how it's set up. You can also see the birds that you mentioned earlier appear on this armor. They appear on our armor as well. You'll see them in a moment. But so that's also a feature here. What's interesting about this armor is that it was gifted to the British monarch, George III. It was gifted to him by Fath Ali Shah. So here we have a completely different kind of link with Fath Ali Shah. There's no inscription of his name or anything like that on this armor, but we know that at some point it was at least associated with the court and went through kind of the diplomatic channels and ended up in the Royal Collection. So I think that's really interesting. And once you know that, it's something that I should say, actually, it came not just this armor, it came with other pieces of armor, kind of a full set. And it came with a letter, and I quite like to, you know, read a little bit about it, just kind of the introduction to give you a sense of the diplomatic language, I guess, going on at the time. So this is, of course, translated. Fath Ali Shah starts his letter saying, "With salutations of friendship, dispelling darkness, and with prayers resplendent as planets, whose brilliancy illuminates the sky of amity, we salute your majesty, our respected brother, the King of Great Britain and Hindustan, at whose court the heavenly bodies submissively attend, the ornament of two thrones, the envy of his foes, and the pride of his friends, the tree whose fortune we pray may be strengthened by the exhilarating breeze, and whose honor and glory we trust may be eternal." So that's quite a, you know, that beats Dear George, I think, as an address. The rest of the letter doesn't get any less Baroque. It's really like this is the feeling of it all. But yeah, this link between Fath Ali Shah and this particular armor, the Royal Collection armor, I think it sheds some light on our armor as well. Because when we look at it kind of stylistically, we look actually like, what does this armor look like? What are some of the features of it? We quite quickly notice some differences. Structurally, it is basically identical. So again, you have the 5 plates. You have the kind of the formed pecs. You can also see kind of a bit with the shoulder blades that's kind of formed. So structurally, it's very, very similar. Even the birds that I mentioned just now are the same, really. But the overlay program is very different, I think. You still have the kind of the border of inscriptions, but in the central field, you don't have your Quranic citations. Instead, you have a kind of a nice scrollwork, floral, vegetal kind of display with animals, with birds in it. So that's quite a contrast from what I think is a much more, I guess austere is the wrong word, but certainly more kind of serious, less playful decoration on the Wallace Collection armor. And I think that's something that kind of suits it being gifted to George III. It's someone who's, of course, not Shia Muslim. He's not Muslim at all, really. So that's a kind of contrast that I just wanted to highlight. And if we look at other body armors in other collections, for example, this one in the Louvre, we find that the kind of the playful variation one of the Royal Collection one, it certainly occurs quite a lot. And again, this one is structurally extremely similar, and even decoratively very, very similar to the Royal Collection one, not so much to ours. So if we recap, have we got, yes, this is ours. And yes, so here are the birds at the top. If we kind of recap, I think it's quite I would say it's quite a clear contrast in terms of the content of the decoration. And even without, wanting to, obviously I'm a little biased here as a curator at the Wallace Collection, but I think even in quality, I think ours is such a remarkable piece of overlay technique. Like it's so beautifully done. It's really remarkable in that sense, I think. But it's very clear that this was something that was made, I think, during the reign of Fath Ali Shah, irrespective of the inscriptions. I think we can definitely say that it was made during that time period. It fits it kind of stylistically, certainly in the way the armor itself is kind of, the steel itself is set up. And yeah, so that's kind of the comparative material that we have. I don't know if you have anything to kind of comment on that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's really important, this comparison with the Royal Collection piece, which is really because we know so solidly that was given by Fath Ali Shah to George III. It really helps us to situate your piece, which is so similar, that it must be connected to Fath Ali Shah and his court, and we just need to work out why the inscriptions were added using his names were added using such a different technique. But I just want to take us away again. We've quickly, in sort of 5 minutes, I want to take us away again for a little bit more religious context, because as Arthur, if I can have the next slide, please.
Yes, sorry.
As Arthur mentioned, my research does focus on the shrines, and I've already referenced them briefly. And you might be thinking, well, what on earth do the shrines have to do with armour? And am I just being overly optimistic? Of course, I would absolutely love it if we could prove that this was a gift by Fath Ali Shah to a shrine, but unfortunately I don't think it was. But I've already mentioned, of course, that we do have evidence for the performance of the ritual drama reenactment within the shrines, but we also have evidence for the display of armour within the shrines. And this is something I can actually see. I just checked the Q&A, and I think there is actually a question about the provenance of this armour, and that's kind of what we just want to wrap up with, which is the afterlife of armour and display of armour, because obviously the Wallace Collection is one of the places you'd go to if you're in London to see armour on display. But actually the shrine in Qom was a place in the 19th century where you also could have gone to see armour on display. So this on your screen is the shrine of Fatima Masumeh in Qom in central Iran. She was the sister of the 8th of the 12 imams, Imam Reza, who is buried in Mashhad in the east of Iran. And these two shrines in Qom and Mashhad are the two most important shrines in Iran and the two most visited. Unfortunately, I can't go into too much detail about them now, but I want to tell you about one aspect of the shrine, which is that they acted as places of refuge. And this does actually stem from the fact that these were actually spaces into which arms were not allowed. Arms could not be taken into the shrine. And this probably finds its roots actually in the very formative stage of, or actually the very earliest days of Islamic practice in Mecca, where arms could not be taken into the haram, the most sacred part of Mecca. So these shrines served as a place of refuge. If you were being pursued by anybody, even the authorities, you could, once you've passed the threshold of the shrine, you cannot be touched, you cannot be removed even from the shrine. And one such person who took refuge in the shrine in Qom was in fact Fath Ali Shah's brother. And this is very, very early on in Fath Ali Shah's reign, when his brother Hussein Quli Khan, his younger brother, actually rebelled against him. He rebelled a number of times unsuccessfully. Finally, sort of on about the 5th time, he realized that all hope was lost, and he fled to Qom and he took refuge in the shrine, presumably leaving his personal arms outside the shrine. And eventually a peace was brokered and by their mother and the ulama, the clergy there, and Hussein Quli Khan continued living in Qom until he caused trouble again, and eventually Fath Ali Shah blinded him. But that's sort of another part of the story. The part that's important for us today is that later in the 19th century, in the mid-19th century, when Nasruddin Shah, who I mentioned, the fourth Qajar Shah, when he was making pilgrimage to Qom once, he recorded in his diary that he saw that they had recently displayed Hussein Quli Khan's arms and armour, actually in the sort of the very main entrance to the shrine. And this includes his helmet, which was decorated with a very large sapphire, his spear, his sword, which had a jade hilt set with rubies, which we were discussing this, and that sounds like it may well be Indian then, and also his gun, which is likely to be a flintlock gun, and also his pistol as well. And his mail, his chainmail as well. So a considerable collection of probably his personal effects that actually Nasruddin Shah tells us that he eventually endowed to the memory of the 12th Imam, and they were therefore kept in the shrine and displayed in the shrine. So that for me was actually a very interesting, and it was not something I was not expecting to have to deal with arms and armour throughout the thesis of writing up all the gifts that were given to the shrine in Qom in this period. But we actually have one more example from Mashhad, as I mentioned, the shrine of Imam Reza in towards the east of Iran. This is a photograph by Abdullah Qajar, he was one of the princes of the dynasty later in the 19th century, but he was also a prolific photographer. And he took this photograph of one of the displays, it's almost a display case in the very heart of the shrine in Mashhad, which, as you can see, is full of jewels, and these are turban ornaments, all set with diamonds and rubies and pearls. But you can see on the right and the left and along the bottom, and we also have daggers in here. And there are a number of these displays, which include daggers and swords, which were on display in the shrine in Mashhad until very recently, and they're still in the collection, in the treasury, in the shrine. So we have a number of religious contexts in the 19th century, in 19th century Iran, where arms and armour did play a role. So this is leading us to ask ourselves, was this armour to be worn for one of these ritual purposes, for one of these religious events, or was it to be worn on the battlefield, which I know, Arthur, you don't think it was to be worn on the battlefield. I'm just clinging to the hope that Fath Ali Shah really did wear it, because when I saw it and held it, that thought was very exciting, because we don't have many things which we know for sure. We hardly anything that we know was worn by Fath Ali Shah. So that's a bit of just to show that arms and armour were in fact collected in a different way, but collected and displayed in Iran. And now, Arthur, can you tell us a bit about collection and display at the Wallace?
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that's quite easy to forget when you walk around in the Wallace Collection and see these objects is that when they were collected, they were really not that old. They were not really antique at all. Of course, we've got 1809, 1810 as well, the date of the inscription at least, quite likely the date the armor was made. And only a few decades later, really, 1860s, 1870s, is when the Wallace Collection, the fourth Marquess of Hertford, the predecessor of Sir Richard Wallace, who the collection is named after, he collected most of the arms and armor, or at least the Indian and the Iranian arms and armor. So between, let's say, 1810 to 1860, it will have traveled. It will have traveled likely, and then it was picked up by the fourth Marquess. He was someone who was very much a kind of, he's a socialite in London, well, in Paris actually primarily, but in Europe in general. I guess he was a very wealthy man, so he obviously had a lot of influence, and he bought a lot at auction. All of the arms and armor that we know of, where we know the provenance, we know that it was bought at auction in the 1860s and in the 1870s. 1870 mostly. So that's really where it came from. And these are mostly French, Paris-based auctions. very rarely do these auctions give any kind of further information on the provenance. So we don't really know where these objects originated prior to their coming up for auction. So I think that's quite an interesting thing. When the whole collection was gifted to the nation and became the Wallace Collection, it was not gifted with any kind of paperwork on any of these objects. So everything we know about the provenance is all relatively recent research, and it's something that's ongoing. We're trying to figure out more about where did these objects come from, kind of prior to them being bought at auction, which is difficult, of course, because there are so few records, and it's kind of purposely, at the time, purposely kept a little bit obscure as well. So you really have to do a lot of good digging. This is, as far as I know, the first photographic evidence of our armor, and this is in the Wallace Collection. Well, it's not the Wallace Collection yet. This is rather the personal collection of Sir Richard Wallace, so prior to it being a museum. And you can see it by the way it's displayed. It's really displayed in a way to highlight the aesthetic qualities of the objects and of the objects together. It's very much a kind of a visual display, not really kind of an informative or didactic display. And our armor, I'm sure Sir Richard Wallace recognized just how good it was in quality, takes a very central position there. So I've noticed that we have very little time left. So I'll just quickly go to the last slide, I think, which is a photograph of how it was when the museum opened. And the attentive among you will notice that the armor here is the wrong way around, which I find quite amusing. And you'll also notice that we have a similar other one, which doesn't have any kind of named inscription on it. So there's much less to say about it, unfortunately. Yeah, so that's this is our armor, of course, and we hope you enjoyed hearing about this, and we really look forward to questions.